Hi, I'm Natasha Sinyanovich, and this is Women Like Sex, a myth-busting podcast that examines the many, many medical, scientific, and social facts about female sexuality that were never, in fact, facts. Especially the very modern-day belief that women don't like sex as much as men do. I'll be speaking with experts, educators, friends, comedians, and more across a spectrum of ages, genders, and cultures to flip the scripts on myths and misconceptions that have long been dictated by not women. Together, we'll replace so much inaccurate messaging with healthier, smarter, factual facts and get the sex ed we wished we'd gotten. If you think men are biologically wired to like sex more than women, then you are definitely not from the Middle Ages, when women were considered uncontrollably hypersexual and men were chaste. To explain why is this week's guest, Dr. Eleanor Janega, an American scholar of medieval European history. The prominent London-based historian, writer, and broadcaster has a great gift for making the past come alive. Her areas of expertise include sexuality and propaganda in the late medieval and early modern periods. Her work not only highlights the ways that our society has been influenced by the past, but in particular, how we tell stories about history that aren't actually true to justify our own desires. In other words, Eleanor Janega is a professional academic mythbuster. She's also written 2 books, The Once and Future Sex, Going Medieval on Women's Roles in Society, as well as The Middle Ages, A Graphic History. And she co-hosts 2 podcasts, Gone Medieval and We're Not So Different. More information about Eleanor Janega and a transcript of our conversation can be found on the episodes page of womenlikesex.com, episode 3. Let's begin.
Well, hey, Natasha.
Hey, Eleanor. I looked it up again, and I found out that in Czech and Slovak, it seems to be the same. So, vitajte opat v podcaste.
Děkuji. It's great to see you again. It's nice to continue to have this conversation because there's literally nothing else I want to talk about other than women and sexuality. I'm so boring. I'm such a one-trick pony. Oh, my God.
I'm that person at parties. So everyone's like, again, do we need to know this statistic?
We do. We do.
Yes, we do.
Until there's thousands of people doing my job for me, I'm going to have to keep doing my job. That's the problem.
So let's start at the top in terms of defining when exactly the Middle Ages are and what during the Middle Ages was considered sex, because those definitions have changed.
Oh, completely. So, all right, Middle Ages, we will start with that. And what we tend to say about the Middle Ages is, this is, to be clear, a very European-centric way of doing things, but I'm a Europeanist, so what are you going to do? And we kind of begin the Middle Ages with the fall of Rome in 476, when the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, is deposed. We can all recall.
Right.
It's incredibly arbitrary at the time. Probably no one said, oh, wow, the Roman Empire has fallen and we're in the Middle Ages now. This is something that historians use in order to make a clear distinction. So that's when we start the medieval period. So 476. And then the other end of when the medieval period ends, that's a little bit more dicey because some people say, well, it starts with the Columbian Exchange in 1492. Other people might say, oh, no, it starts with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, because if you begin the medieval period with the fall of Rome, you end it with the fall of Eastern Rome.
Mm-hmm.
My general rule of thumb is that it's very difficult to say, but fundamentally, if you see Protestants, you've gone too far. So the minute you got Martin Luther, that's it. You're in the early modern period now, because, kind of the overarching hallmark of the European Middle Ages is the construction of the church and its hegemony over Western Europe. And then when it loses that, I think that you're pretty done.
And by church, you mean the Catholic Church.
Yeah, the Catholic Church. Yeah. So, they don't call themselves that at the time. That's just the church, right? But,
right.
We had to invent Protestants so that we could call them that. By the time you're in the 16th century, you're in the early modern period, certainly. And, if what we're doing is we are going around defining the Middle Ages by saying, well, the church exists in this structure or another, then it stands to reason that our definitions of sex are really defined by what the church thinks about sex. The thing about that is that the church really thinks there's a lot more sex than we do now.
They think there's a lot more going on, or they think about it more?
Well, I mean, a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. Basically, the thing is, they really kind of think that anything, things that we would now refer to as foreplay, they're like, well, babes, that's just sex. Like, if you got to say sex in it, it's also sex. So, like, oral sex is sex, manual sex is sex, interfemoral sex, which there's rather a lot of in the Middle Ages.
Which is, remind everyone?
Frottage. So kind of like sticking your junk in between someone else's legs and going to town on it.
Right.
For the Catholic Church, all of these things are sex. And what they spend the great majority of the Middle Ages attempting to do is trying to stop people from having all of those kinds of sex and just focus up on the one acceptable form of sex, which is married penis and vagina sex for the purposes of procreation.
P&V. Who invents P&V?
Great question.
The penis and the vagina have been around, obviously, since our earliest ancestors. But this fixation on P&V sex...
Oh, yeah.
...that has followed us into the early days of sexology and still today.
Yeah, and it's very funny to me because it is certainly one of these things wherein now, when we talk about sex, I think that we've got a real problem where we tend to define it as penetrative.
Right.
A penis has to go into something in order for it to be sex, which, is terrible for our queer friends. It also means that a lot of things that people would have for a very long time agreed were sex are suddenly not sex.
And it's also left a large number of unhappy women.
Oh, yeah. Oh, God, yeah. And so, like, my thing is I actually agree with the church on what sex is. What I don't agree with the church on is the kind that you should have, right? Because the church is like, please, I'm begging you to stop going down on each other. What you need to be doing is having sex with your husband or wife specifically for the purposes of procreation. And at no other time should you be having sex. And I find it absolutely incredible that now here we are in the 21st century and we really agree with the church on this one, which is hilarious to me. Because it's like they were spending centuries upon centuries trying to fight this fight, and everyone was like, no, I want a hand job, like in a field. That's what I want. And the church is like, stop it. You've got to stop doing that right now. And somehow they won.
And everything else that was not sex for them was sodomy.
Exactly. So basically, and now we tend to just think that sodomy means like gay sex, and more particularly means anal sex. But sodomy, the definition thereof, is any kind of sex that can't result in procreation. So, I mean, technically, if you're having like penis and vagina missionary sex with your wife and she's pregnant, that's sodomy. I hate to break it to you, but like, you can't get double pregnant, right? So that's definitely sodomy. And the church would agree with me on that one. They would be like, you shouldn't be having sex in these circumstances. That's unruly. So interestingly, the church and I agree on what sex is, but for two different reasons. Because they're saying, and that's bad, and I'm saying, and that's good. So that's just kind of the way about it. But having said that, it's not just the church that has these ideas. It's something that is really ossified as a result of the church. And it's certainly not just the medieval church that has these ideas. This is something that begins in the late antique period. And it's something that St. Augustine of Hippo writes about really extensively because he's kind of a recovering fuckboy. That's his deal. And he had all this sex, like all the sex. And then he finds God. And then he's like, oh, I really regret all that hot sex I was having, blah, blah, blah.
And now the rest of you can't have fun. When was that again?
Augustine is like 4th century, I think,
okay,
if memory serves me correctly. And so he's writing rather a lot about this. And, to be fair, also, people have this tendency to think that all pagans are like, oh, yeah, have all the sex that you want. That's great. And that is not true either. There's a lot of hand-wringing, in particular in Roman pagan circles, about having kind of the wrong kinds of sex or having too much sex. And, the wrong kinds of sex are, surprise, non-procreative. And there's all this hand-wringing on the part of Romans who think that if you have too much sex with women, you will start having sex with men. Because it's like, fellas, is it gay to have sex with women, basically? Because women are the ones who enjoy sex. So if you're enjoying sex all the time, then you're going to end up gay. And really what you should be doing is thinking about Rome You should be saving your sperm to have like ideal Roman children.
You should be thinking of Caesar and country.
Exactly, exactly. So, this is certainly a proclivity that had already existed in the European imagination, such as it was, before the church came along and ossified it. But basically, the church comes along and says, that's right, because of Jesus. It's something that basically gets turned into a dogma, whereas before it was a philosophy. I suppose, there was no religious idea that said you shouldn't be having sex like that necessarily, but there were philosophical arguments for it instead. So yeah, it's a process of turning that into a religion. And then now we've turned that into a science somehow, I use the term science loosely.
With heavy air quotes.
Yeah, exactly.
So you said something when you were talking about the Romans, which when I read your book, The Once and Future Sex, can we say read anymore? I listened to it.
I love the audio version of it. My friend, the talented voice actress, Samara Naomi, read it, and I absolutely think she did a bang-up job.
Oh, yeah. Beautiful voice. A great voice. And the right amount of snark.
Yeah, it really helps to get your actual friends to read your books because she knows how I do punchlines.
After listening to The Once and Future Sex, I thought, do I just have to rename my entire project? Because if you had told anyone anytime in recorded European history, except for now, that women like sex, it would have been like, duh. Right?
Exactly. And we're organizing our entire society to try to calm them down because all they want to do is have sex and we can't stop them from trying to have sex all the time.
Women were insatiably hypersexual, right?
Oh, yes.
And men were chaste?
Because sexuality in this conception is negative. Right. So, for the obvious Christian reasons, but also, from the hangover from the Roman state as well, because fundamentally, medieval Europeans like to think that they're Romans. That's their whole thing. They're like, we're this new sort of Roman. And so we do everything that Romans do, but we just do it with Christianity on top. And so they have these pretty fixed ideas about femininity and masculinity. And these, even come to us from Aristotle and Plato, but Aristotle writes about this rather a lot. And essentially the way that they define women is as not men.
Oh, right.
Yeah, you got the default. And then there's this other one that is not a man, and Aristotle variously refers to women as deformed men or inside out men. And so essentially women kind of act as a negative to the positives of men, and the things that men are that are positive are logical and spiritual. Because, obviously we really like religion at this point in time. And women instead are illogical and emotional and carnal. Women are very in touch with their bodies and they're defined by their relationship to their bodies, whereas men are defined by their relationship to their minds.
Right.
And so as a result of this, women are the more sexual gender because sex is sort of disordered. An interest in sex or a delight in sex is something that means that you are not a serious intellectual person. And so that women must be into it then, right? Case closed, right? And then this expands with Christianity, in particular with the story of the Garden of Eden. Augustine writes a lot about this. And obviously the issue here is that Eve is the one who eats from the fruit of the tree of knowledge and realizes that she's naked. And the original sin here isn't necessarily the realizing that one is naked. That's not the problem. It's the disobedience against God and then realizing you're naked and then being turned on by it.
Right.
So it's not just like, oh, I'm naked. It's like, ooh, I'm naked. and therein lies the issue. And so women are responsible for this downfall of men, and therefore women are the sexual gender because they're the ones who did this. Right. And, if it wasn't for women, and women kind of dragged men into it and said, hey, yeah, check this out. We're going to have a sexy time.
Right.
Women, therefore, are seducers. Women are temptresses. Women are the ones that are responsible for sex even existing at all in a sexy way. Because before the idea is if Adam and Eve had got around having sex in the Garden of Eden, it would have just been like, I don't know, washing the dishes or something, shaking hands. You would just go, oh, shall we get pregnant? Yeah, okay. And then you would just do it and nobody would care.
Done and off to the next chore.
Yeah, exactly. It's the lust that is an issue. And so, this then just follows that since lustfulness is bad and spiritualness is good, Christianity therefore kind of sets women up to fail, as does ancient Greek and Roman mythology and philosophy, because it posits that women are not men and men can master themselves, they can master their bodies, whereas women are defined by their bodies. And to be defined by one's body is to be ruled by it, essentially. So women are therefore more interested in sex than men are, which is bad, right? And, there are then I would argue there are probably some knock-on social effects from this, because if you exist in a society that's constantly telling you, yeah, you are outrageously over the top sexual, you are so horny, you can't control yourself, you're kind of like, yeah, I guess so, man. I guess, yeah.
But it flipped at some point. The script flipped where now it's men who can't control themselves and are alibied. And that is at the core of rape culture. We now live in a world where women don't really like sex that much, or girls, but there's this double standard, right? We exude or are supposed to exude sexuality, but not like sex.
I find this is so interesting because what has happened in each of these cases, so within the medieval conception, or indeed the ancient conception of sexuality, or our new modern one, is, well, women are still responsible for it, though. So in the older conception of women being massively sexual, it's like, oh yeah, you can't control yourself, so that's why you're dressing very sexually, and you need to learn to master yourself, control yourself, not do all of these very, very naughty things. But then in the new understanding of it, with men being insatiably sexual and unable to control their sexuality, it's still women's job to de-sex the situation and to dress a particular way and to therefore shepherd men in the correct direction. So all that's kind of happened here is saying, well, who is it that likes sex? And, I would argue that basically the reason that men are the ones who like sex now is that we've decided sex is good.
Mm-hmm.
So the ancient and the medieval idea of sex is that sex is this really fun, sexy thing to do that sometimes results in procreation.
Right.
And our idea now is that sex is this thing that results in procreation, and sometimes it's fun and sexy. Sex is defined as being this thing that is for procreation, which is what makes it scientific. It has a use. It has a particular way of marshaling itself, which is an absolutely ridiculous thing, because, if you look at how difficult it actually is to get pregnant, it's really quite something. My boyfriend is a sex educator, and basically he's kind of like not allowed to talk about how difficult it is to get pregnant in front of teenagers, because they're like, no, tell them that
the minute you look at somebody,
they're pregnant. Whereas it's actually this quite difficult thing, and the great majority of the times that people have sex in their life is actually going to be for fun. It's for fun, and sometimes it results in pregnancy, I would argue.
The vast majority of sex that we're having is recreational, not procreational.
Imagine how many children one would have to have. It's physically impossible. So, but we turned it around, because the new kind of religion is this idea that things can be scientific, that they can have a scientific explanation for why they exist. And so it still needs to be generative. It still needs to be procreative. It still needs to be all these things that, like, St. Augustine is arguing for.
Even the definition that sexologists use really only recently stopped being P and V.
And this is the thing. It's just so funny. We act as though we are like quite enlightened now, but I'm like, you're getting at exactly the same thing as a bunch of religious dudes were back before the fall of Rome. And you're just kind of patting yourself on the back and saying, oh, no, this is science. And no, it's not, babe. And ironically, this is kind of where the social sciences and things like that and the humanities come in, because we can talk about the actual reasons that people are having sex and get to the bottom of it. But that's seen as insufficiently serious, even though it's more accurate, even though it is actually a better way of talking about and thinking about the kind of sex that most people are having.
To do that, though, levels the playing field.
Mm-hmm.
And that scares the shit out of people. To do that, you have to say that we have to get away from the procreational talk, the procreative talk. I mean, it's obviously there. It's how the species is propagated.
Yeah.
But you also have to say that both people like it, or It could be 5 people, it could be 10 people. It doesn't matter.
However many you got.
But if you're talking two, and if you're talking male, female, cis women and men, and hetero, to change that conversation, you have to say, hey, both people are coming at it, no pun intended, with the same amount of fun and joy and excitement and or curiosity.
Sociologist Gail Rubin has this idea about the charmed circle of sex. This is this idea that we have a charmed circle of like all of the kinds of sexuality that are acceptable, and it's like monogamous, procreative, non-commercial, heterosexual, obviously. These are all the things that we find acceptable. And then we have the outer circle of all that, which is stuff like kink or commercial sex or homosexual sex or, just not partnered sex. And we're like, oh no, you shouldn't, not like that, and what I find really interesting is that we have created these incredibly labyrinthine systems to come back to exactly the same conclusions that the church was having, other than and also women don't like sex.
The only big changes are women don't like sex the way they used to in the rest of recorded, at least European history. And a lot of sex doesn't make you feminine, it makes you masculine for men.
Yeah.
Sex was considered effeminate and feminizing.
Yeah. And I mean, it's feminizing from the ancient and medieval perspective, because the idea is that, we're still working off of humoral theory in the way that we were up until the 19th century. But the idea here is that, again, men and women are polar opposites from each other. So men are hot and dry and women are cold and wet. Which I almost wanted to call my book Cold and Wet, but I was like,
how did you put it? Like the lizards? Like we're basically lizards.
Yeah, we're like stupid horny lizard people is what women are like. And so women are desirous of sex because, like lizards, they need to be warmed up. And you can warm up women through sex in 2 ways. The first is just the fricative properties of sex. So it's just like rubbing sticks together kind of a thing. But then the other is a semen, which women love. And women love semen because it is hot, because it's sort of like all of the masculineness in one place. That is something that is then going to warm them up. And so that causes 2 problems for the right thinking man. The first is that if you are expending too much semen, then you become cold and wet because you're losing this essence. You're losing this hot dryness that is going out of you. Right. You're becoming colder and wetter like a woman. And so this is the thing that, I mean, surprisingly, it still does occasionally come up. So, you'll see this, for example, in stuff like a No Nut November.
I do not know. A No Nut November?
Oh, Natasha, I'm going to ruin your life. It is a thing that is started by, there's kind of a group that is called NoFap, which are connected to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So it's kind of like a Mormon thing, and in that way that Mormons are obsessed with porn. And they simply love to say that they are addicted to pornography, which is not a thing you can be because that's not real. But and they'll be like, "Oh, I'm addicted to pornography. I look at it once a month and jack off." Oh no, and it's like, yeah, buddy, like calm down. But they started this thing a few years ago now that is called No Nut November, and the idea is that you're not supposed to jack off for November. And they will say all this wild stuff about how, if you're not jacking off, it helps to like clarify your mind. And there's all these men online being like, I learned Spanish this month instead of jacking off, which is like, how much are you jacking off, buddy? We do also see this occasionally in conversations with male athletes. So stuff like, you don't have sex until the finals are over, or things like this. There is this kind of a masculine way of talking about these things, and very, very occasionally you will see ideas like this kind of creep in with the whole you shouldn't be having sex that much, but usually you shouldn't be having sex that much, it's usually with one woman. It's kind of like, not, you shouldn't be having sex with 16 women. It's that you shouldn't have sex 16 times with one woman, right? Because like that is somehow emasculating. And then the trouble is, if you have depleted your semen to that extent, then you become cold and wet like a woman. Then you might start wanting to have sex with men like women do. Simultaneously, like the women are going to grow stronger and more powerful because
the women are going to turn into men. And the men are going to turn into women.
And there'll be dogs living with cats, and all hell is going to break loose. But it's all this pseudoscientific nonsense. But it still exists in some corners of our imagination.
Beyond even just the imagination, when you talk about the ancient Greek idea of men are the default human and women are deformities thereof.
Yep.
In an interview I did with Helen O'Connell, the doctor who correctly mapped the clitoris, the correct anatomy of the clitoris.
Huge fan, yeah.
She came to her work because in her 1980s anatomy book, they were still teaching that parts of female genitalia were just a failure of male genital formation. So again, there's the default.
Yeah, and this is the thing, right? We know that, for example, medieval and ancient people, they don't have a concept of the clitoris. They do notice that women seem to go crazy if you rub towards the top of the vulva.
Right.
They do notice that, and that's something that they remark upon.
And they called it the vulva or the vagina.
They tend to kind of call it the genital member.
Female genitalia.
Yeah, exactly. So they're kind of like, they'll start saying womb usually if it's internal for how we would use vagina, but they just tend to say like pudenda. That's the big one. They notice that women tend to like that, but they're not going in close enough to kind of map things out to have a name for a clitoris.
I'd like to know when we started calling the vulva the vagina. When we started calling everything by that which gives men pleasure.
I bet you it's some 18th century stuff. It's going to be like some Enlightenment nonsense almost. I'm just like, the Enlightenment. That's just my answer to everything. Those guys, when everything gets worse, the Enlightenment. I would imagine that it's linked to that, because there are, ongoing desires to be very particular about anatomy and labeling things. They're huge on that in the Enlightenment, aren't they? So yeah, 17th century, 18th century, I'd imagine. That's usually when these things happen. But, and certainly what is happening at that time is also this new identification of sex as positive.
In the Enlightenment.
Yeah, in the 18th century, because now we've decided that sex is for procreation, and that's the only thing that it's for. It's got these knock-on side effects, which are the pleasure of it, but it's for procreation. And so if it's for something good, then men must love it, right? Because what defines a men is that they are the good ones. And so if it's for something that is positive and good, then men like it, and then therefore women don't like it. And of course you have really disordered relationships to sexuality at this point in time, like the Victorians and their whole angel in the house thing, where it's like, oh, you wouldn't want to have sex with your wife, but you'll go see like sex workers,
right?
It also has this kind of crystallization about, well, who counts as a woman? And it comes around to, women are, white bourgeois women, like members of the working class. They're not really women. And certainly non-white women aren't really women.
Right.
There's this protected class of white middle to upper class women who are women, and everyone else, you can go have sex with them if you don't want to bug your wife about it, that kind of thing. None of it makes a whole lot of sense the moment you start looking into it at all. But I think there's this real desire in our society to act as though there is some grand narrative that explains our relationship to sexuality that is logical and that will still let men come out on top, as it were. So, the men still have to be in control of this situation, and it has to be beneficial to them.
Men have been writing the narrative. Men were the chroniclers, the scientists for all but modern time. I mean, not that women didn't do any of these things. We just don't have a lot of records of them, right?
Absolutely. And certainly, it'll be so frustrating in my own research, because occasionally, like there'll be a woman who crops up and is a professor at Salerno, which is like the big medical school in Europe at the time. And women aren't supposed to be able to go to university at all whatsoever, like let alone rise through the ranks and become a professor. And you're like, well, how did she get there? And everyone's like, I don't know.
Nobody bothered to write it down.
It's very frustrating because it indicates that it's common enough that it isn't like, wow, check out this chick. We've got to like write down everything that's going on with her. But it's also uncommon enough that we know her name and we're like, well, why is it just her? So we have these indications that it's possible for women to crop up in these places, and they just don't get recorded because, well, you just don't talk about it, do you? So that is just kind of the story of a European history, and certainly, for quite some time, people aren't literate for the most part, and then for at least the medieval period, being literate counts only if you're reading and writing in Latin. And even if you can read, a lot of the time you can't write, because writing is really difficult. Like writing with a quill is just it's a nightmare. It's something that I've tried to do it, and I know how to write. So people aren't necessarily writing things down. And so we just don't get these particular worldviews. But then when they do peek through, we get really differing ideas. So, for example, we hear from Hildegard of Bingen, who is now considered a doctor of the church, and she's a saint, and she's a polymath.
Is she 14th century?
13th. Yeah, and she writes rather a lot about everything. She's a natural philosopher, which is what we call scientists before we had science, as well as a theologian, and she composes music, and she has visions from God, and she's doing it all. Girl's doing it all, and she writes about sexuality, and she's got one of the first ever descriptions of a woman's orgasm. So thanks very much, Hildegard. And she also has a really different take on sexuality than men at the time have, probably unsurprisingly.
You don't say.
I know, right? Or they're like, oh, women, they're just this like overwhelmingly horny forest fire, that will burn down everything in their wake. And she's like, I don't know, man. And then she likens women's sexuality to kind of a gentle ocean. It can be stirred up, but it's just sort of there and lapping all the time. And it isn't actually a destructive force and shouldn't be seen as a destructive force. Does this take off? No.
Oh, you don't say.
It's not like anyone goes, damn, like Hildegard is really right on this. I guess I have a lot of growing up to do. That isn't what happens. But it certainly is true that what it shows us is that there's women who are saying, I don't think that's right, or my observations don't really jibe with what everybody else is saying. So we do see that women do try to push back. It's just that, wow, this one genius who was allowed to rise to the top because she was a genius, you don't say, like, we've got her take on the matter.
One voice doesn't change.
Yeah.
It doesn't turn the tide, especially when things are so deeply ingrained.
Exactly. So, it's one of these things where we do have these examples of when things kind of go right and women crop up in the record and they're able to advocate for themselves. But that doesn't mean anybody's listening. And one voice among thousands is simply going to get drowned out.
There's Christine de Pizan.
Yeah.
Who I also discovered thanks to your book. And I want to read from her book of the City of Ladies, this passage. I could hardly find a book on morals where, even before I had read it in its entirety, I did not find several chapters or certain sections attacking women, no matter who the author was.
Mm-hmm.
This is 800 years ago. 800 years ago, there's a woman saying, hey, all I hear is trash talk. All I hear are vicious attacks on me and my kind. And then there's one of the ladies in the City of Ladies, Lady Reason, who explains the causes of misogyny. When I read this, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry or scream or all of the above. So the causes of misogyny are good intentions, though unjustified, formerly promiscuous men who gave into debauchery in youth, who denigrate women as a way to purge their own bile, jealous, bitter, rancorous men reacting to women of greater intelligence or nobler heart, or scandalmongers by nature who vilify and slander women because they speak ill of everyone. So basically, she's covered everything.
Those are the ones, isn't it? And I find her descriptions in the book of the City of Ladies incredibly moving. She basically says, I wanted to write this because, I keep reading over and over again how much women sucks and how we're awful, but I never actually see it borne out in the women who are around me. And, it would be too much to call any of these women feminists because there's no such thing at the time. But what we do see is even in these circumstances where women have incredibly limited options and they're being told over and over again, this is what you're like, this is what you're like, you're stupid, you're evil, you're hypersexual beast that needs to be tamed, we still see them fighting back. And I find that incredibly instructive, and certainly for me it's also kind of galvanizing because I'm like, all right, like, who am I to give up in the face of rancor when I've got Christine de Pizan who was out here able to say these things in a much more difficult time. I find it incredibly interesting and useful because it's one thing to have the social construction of what these ideas are, and there's another about reporting experience. And I think that's why this project is such an important one, because again, we're in this time when we're being told that women are completely unsexual now, right? Like, we have to be fooled into having sex by being given gifts or relationships or gamed,
right,
negged until we have sex with men. And, it stands to reason, obviously, that we are neither the medieval conception of like these insatiable, overly sexed creatures, nor are we completely asexual and desirous of never having sex in our lives. It's probably somewhere in between, and, probably also a spectrum that we simply exist on as humans.
It's individual. And then among individuals, it also depends on who you're doing it with, who you're attracted to. And that could be someone you've known for an hour or your partner. And that goes in waves, right? You could be with somebody for a long time. You'd be like, okay, there's moments where you can't get enough of each other. And gender doesn't matter.
No. My go-to joke about this is always like, yeah, if I was having sex with a misogynist, I probably would say that I wasn't very interested in it either.
Right.
Like if my only available option was some guy who was like, women are barely people to me. By the way, we're going to have penis and vagina sex for, 3 minutes now. I'd be like,
As a friend of mine says, men have been stopping halfway through for millennia. So it doesn't even have to be misogynist. If you're talking about a man who doesn't know and a woman who doesn't feel strong enough and allowed enough. And I don't like the word empowered. I'm kind of tired. That's thrown around. It's thrown around very often.
Yeah.
Empowerment is only part of the picture. We need to disempower the bad messaging.
Yeah.
If you have all these people who don't know enough about what sex really is, that it's not just P&V intercourse, and you have women who have a really hard time saying what they want because they've been told that they don't want anything. Or to even say that they want something is to be asking too much, is to be dirty, is to be shameful. And so many people still feel that way. I still get people who tell me that the title of my project is kind of naughty and scandalous.
I mean, and this is the thing, is it is kind of scandalous, because to even infer that women could be interested in sex is basically saying that it's all right to be interested in sex, right? If women are the ones that are tasked with keeping public decency, then that's a huge hurdle to overcome, right? And you have to like create these perfect Goldilocks situations with I always say it's kind of like the one picture that always gets put with every article about sex, where it's the two pairs of white feet sticking out from underneath like a white duvet.
Right.
That's the kind of sex that you're allowed to have and that you're allowed to enjoy. And really, what we need to kind of be thinking about, I'm going to steal this. I'm going to steal my boyfriend's work. Here you go. Like, the problem with our society is, even when we talk about consent, we think of that it only applies to sex, where it's like, that's where, and that consent is kind of this transactional thing. I said yes, so then therefore. I said no, so then therefore. And it's like, well, that's not, we have a profoundly non-consensual society, where we're going around and basically making people do things they don't want to do constantly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and so how would sex ever be any different when it's also laden with all of these philosophical, religious, ideas about who wants what and why?
You can only say no if you have enough power in a given situation to do so.
Yeah. And it's like, well, we probably shouldn't be having a conversation where anything is about yes and no anyway. Like, if you've gone that far, you're probably way down the road of non-consent, right? It should be a, hey, what could we do? And not a yes, no, like tick this box, right? That's not what we're supposed to be doing. So it is frustrating when I think about all of these things. But at the same time, I think that we're kind of on the right track in that we're discussing these things at all whatsoever, because the purpose of my work, and I dare say the purpose of this project in general, of yours, is that we need to kind of come to the fact that sexuality is a social construct.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And when I say that something is a social construct, I don't mean that it doesn't exist. I mean, it does exist, but that we made it like this.
We've changed those definitions, and that's the beauty of your work. You highlight that, you talk about it, and also in doing so, show us that things are arbitrary. These definitions are mutable and mutating.
Mm-hmm. And it's just the thing that we will do all the time, because of the way our society is set up, is we change the math equation constantly, but we come to the exact same outcome, which is, and women are bad. So it's like, if sex is bad, then it's like, and women like it because women are bad. But then the minute sex is good, they're like, so women don't like it because women are bad,
When you have a certain type of person that wields power since time immemorial, and they're the ones, as I keep saying, literally dictating the rules, dictating the constructs. It's playground politics. If you've got yellow glasses and a black shirt and long brown hair, i.e. me today, you get 5 more points. You get extra goals. And when our power structure is built on that and it's constantly being used over and over and over again to say, well, these are the rules. Somebody just arbitrarily, some kid on a playground created those rules. He just happened to be called a philosopher and he had a fancy name and now we study him.
It is just like, yeah, and he had a fancy name and was able to be a philosopher because he was really rich and owned a lot of slaves who were doing all the work for him, so he could sit around and opine.
Right.
These things are built on layers upon layers of inequality. And it's important to just notice that. And I'm not saying that, Aristotle never had a good idea in his life. I'm just saying he had a lot of stupid ones, right? And also, I just don't really know why this guy from thousands of years ago should be bossing me around right now.
Right.
And it is interesting. I do think that there's also kind of something here, especially about the way that we relate to women and sexuality. Also has a lot to do with one of the things that kind of happens, I think, in patriarchal situations is where men are the default humans. You have this thing where men can be heterosexual, but I wouldn't call them heteroromantic a lot of the time. There's a lot of men out there who want to have sex with women, but other than that, they don't want anything to do with them. They would rather hang out with other men, talk with other men, do things with other men. And then unfortunately, like the one thing they need from women is sexual availability or someone to raise their children that they want to have but don't want to raise, right? And so that kind of breeds a form of resentment because it's like, oh, the one thing I want from you and you don't even want to have it with me just because I don't like you very much. You can tell that like my resentment of you is absolutely dripping off of me. And this is kind of what happens when you describe women as something other than human, which is essentially what we end up being within these ideas. Even now that we know, well, we all start off XX, don't we? And then something happens and then you end up something else, but it's still presumed that you start off a man and something goes wrong.
Right.
We are still looked at as though we are unable to reason, as though we are completely unintelligent beings who have to be cajoled into particular ways.
And very emotional, extremely emotional. Unable to control our emotions. And part of that is, right, little boys start off very emotional. At age 6 or 7, there's studies that show, right, they're saying that they love their friends. And then at some point, that's taught out of them. Society beats it out of them. Yeah. And of course, that's speaking very generally. When I think about the workplaces I've worked in, my male colleagues and my male bosses have often been so much more emotional. Temper tantrums. In front of everyone, you're like, are you kidding me? Suddenly, I'm not talking to a peer, I'm talking to a 5-year-old, and I have to find a way to placate them.
The thing is that anger doesn't count as an emotion because it's the one that men are allowed to have. Yeah. But then if a man gets angry at you and you cry, you were emotional when you're a woman because, sadness is an emotion or frustration is an emotion and things like that are emotions. Whereas, anger isn't because anger is masculinized. Right. And men can't be emotional because I just said so right now.
And that's also intertwined with when women behave in certain ways. Like, oh, she's really masculine. She's had to be a ball breaker. She's had to be really masculine to get this job. It's like that could just be the way that she is. And can we stop breaking things down in these really simplistic ways of how men are supposed to be and how women are supposed to be?
It's one of these things that is also frustrating because, we're also told that this is what is necessary to succeed in the world. And then you do it and you get punished for that as well. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. And thus has it ever been. But, I think that it is important to kind of look at that and look at all of the ridiculous ways we've justified this over time. Because, if you look at the medieval ancient period, they'll say, okay, yeah, well, men do get angry. Okay, but they get angry because they're hotter than women, and people will notice that kind of tends to slow down with like older age, and they'll be like, oh, it's because the aging process is kind of imagined as a process of becoming cooler over time. So the men become less angry because they are less hot, and then you die.
It's funny how even the humors, we still have that ingrained in us in a way. I was talking to a friend of mine about, after the first time we talked, and was saying how women were considered cold and wet and men were hot and dry. And he said, well, that's just so funny because women are clearly hotter than men. I was like, and he wasn't talking about, looks hot.
But we do love, especially, within our particular culture, we love to gender things. Mm-hmm. That's a thing that we like to do. And we like to say that these aspects have a gender and this is what it means to be XYZ, right? Whereas probably a better way to do things is not try to not gender everything possibly, just possibly. And it's a bit of a frustrating time because of the way that we have kind of moved on to these ideas that our gender views are scientific is what we like to have, and we get to this horrible point that we're at now where there's just therefore this definition of women still being defined as being essentially like mommies to be. That's the thing about being a woman, is like, to be a woman is to have babies, and that's how we're going to define women. And it just breaks my heart because that's also how we define women in the medieval period. And so it's like we've come absolutely nowhere because you are still supposed to be this soft maternal thing that is going to one day have babies, and then that's the thing about women, is their potential for motherhood. We are not humans in our own rights. We're humans because of our potential fecundity and the fact that we could, in theory, bring a man into the world, and then we will have done something worthwhile with our lives.
That is very much up for public debate. It is up for legislative and judicial debate. And something that you said, I don't remember if it was when we talked or maybe it was in your book, that women's lives are public until they have children. Women's bodies and women's existence is very much public until it's privatized. Because when you have a baby, then it's all on you.
Completely. And this is one of these things that has only got worse over time because, at least in the medieval period, when you lived in like a little village with everyone you ever knew, you could do stuff, be like, yo, girl, could you take this baby for a second? I've just got to do, whatever. But as we became, atomized with the move into the factory and away from the fields, we increasingly became treated as though, essentially what women are and what families are. Families are the nuclear unit because that can be moved around more easily in order to use us as workers, right? And it's frustrating because that motherhood always becomes privatized, but the work never ends, right? For the great majority of human history, women have been in the workforce.
Right, which is something else you talk about very passionately and very adamantly because you would not know it.
Oh, you wouldn't, because it's just like one of these things where, again, it's so common that you just don't talk about it. So, women are always there in the workshop alongside their husbands doing exactly the same job, but also doing all the housework and probably also keeping the books because that's a woman's job, right? And then you have this brief blip kind of from the Enlightenment onward where, again, because we are so scientifically looking at gender roles, and it's like, well, women are for being mommies, so the thing that they should only be as mommies. So you have this retreat from working life, very specifically of bourgeois women.
Nobody could afford to not work except for nobility and bourgeois women and white women.
Yeah, and white women, right? It's like, yeah, okay, that's really cute, but like, who's mopping the floors around here? It ain't men, right? And then you can be forgiven for thinking that women in the workplace is kind of an invention of the World War II and on, society, because that's how we talk about it. And it's not true. Working class women have always been working. That's why we're called working class women, and even before then, everybody was working. This is kind of, you're talking about like a 20-year period. I think that's wrong. The peak of women not working was kind of pre World War One. It's sort of like, as we would say here, the Edwardian period. So like before World War One, kind of after Victoria, like that little bit, that's when we had the most women who were out of the workforce. And then from then on, not so much. But we still pretend that because sexuality exists in order for women to get pregnant, because pregnancy is the thing about us. And, again, we're still kind of defining women as the sexual gender.
It's still the receptacle, right? The receptacle of the seed.
Yeah, then that's the thing about you. Not that I think that necessarily like one's career is the most important thing about one either.
The most important thing about a person is what they deem to be the most important thing in their life.
Exactly. And we're doing this thing, of wringing our hands once again and saying, oh, isn't it really true that all women should just be mommies? And shouldn't you just be, I don't know, making a home and doing all these things, which is just this ridiculous imaginary thing that never existed. And it's frustrating because you can't talk about any of these things without talking about sexuality. And frankly, I find that whole thing a kink. It's like, okay, bro, you've just got like some weird breeding kink, and like, that's fine. You're allowed to have that, but could you not do it at me?
And I'm also allowed to not want that.
I don't want to like have to hear about it and also have my life governed by it. Like, it's fine. You do whatever it is you want behind closed doors.
Women were in the workforce, but you don't see their names often in the documents. So how do you, as a historian, find those records? If nothing else, to be able to prove to someone who says it's not true, to say, no, here they are.
Usually it's like wife. It's the thing. It's so depressing. It's so depressing. I mean, you'll see this all the time if you're in older graveyards here in the UK. It'll be like, here is Adam Johnson and blah, 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 blah. And there's like a whole big epitaph about him. And it'll be like, and wife. And you're like, oh, there she is. There's that wife that we all know so much about. And so we will know things like this occasionally from records. We will know that so-and-so's wife is looking after the books while he's away because they have like some thing about that where, he writes her a letter and says, hey, can you do X, Y, and Z? And it'll be like, dearest, whatever. But, you show up in tax records as Mrs. Adam Johnson. Right. Like that's how you end up in records. And occasionally we can find things, though, from taxation records. Occasionally we'll have more of a name. But yeah, it's a phenomenon. We have a term for it. It's called coverture. So, the idea is that you are someone's daughter and then you become someone's wife, and you are either Adam Johnson's daughter or you're Adam Johnson's wife. And you don't really have an identity other than that. But we certainly know that about you. But then we also have lots of women who do show up in taxation records. That's the big one, because the government will get you, baby. God bless, the Holy Roman Empire, the German lands, they love a tax record, right? So we know tons and tons and tons about all of the women who are keeping shops, because that's like one of the pretty feminized professions is like, oh yeah, I run this shop selling whatever, right? And so we know about their tax records. We'll know from their wills when they die. Like if you leave your own will, which especially if you're widowed, suddenly your name comes up. If you die before your husband, that it's like, oh, that you're out of luck. But if your husband dies first, then suddenly you become like the businesswoman. And there's hand wringing about women at the time who are widows because they've got a lot of money and you can't tell them what to do. And they're like, oh, also, not only is there a worry because this woman is out of the control of a man and she's got all this money, but they're like, I bet she's having sex. Like immediately.
And you have to laugh because it's, well, bittersweet laugh. But we talked about this last time, this idea of women were going to marry because that was your only way out.
Yeah.
Because you belonged to your father or your uncle. Right?
Wherever.
But this idea that meant, well, you can't just be with me for the fact that I have given you the only escape and the only, hopefully you even smidgen of autonomy from your parental home. You have to love me and you have to want just me and have sex with just me. I can't just be this social and socioeconomic salvation for you. You have to love me for who I am.
Yeah.
But if there was no agency and if there weren't a lot of options.
Yeah. And the thing is also, obviously, that's not how things work out. And we've got plenty of records that show that like people are having sex behind their spouses' backs, left, right, and center, like all throughout the medieval period, not least because priests are constantly like, stop it, stop doing that right now, but we get the lots of records about this, or to the point where it just like kind of exists in popular culture. Like you read the Canterbury Tales and half of those are jokes about how everyone hates their old husband that they married for money and they're like trying to shag the local carpenter. And it's just kind of understood that that's what's going to happen.
When we studied the Canterbury Tales in AP English, we were not presented with those tales.
You never get to read the good ones. They're going to have you read the Wife of Bath's tale, but not her prologue. You're not reading the Miller's Tale, I'll tell you that much. That's the one about having sex in a pear tree while your husband's down below you. These are all incredibly sexual stories, and they're usually about women stepping out on men, right? Like that's usually what they're about. And so we know that there is rather a lot of non-monogamy that is happening like willingly or unwillingly. Like it seems that like in the upper echelons of society, there's a lot more kind of consensual non-monogamy going on, because since you get married for business reasons,
right,
up around the noble level, that everyone's like, yeah, like you don't want to have sex with your spouse, you want to have sex with someone else. So it seems like that's a lot more the done thing. But the lower rungs of society, you sort of get to marry who you want to. So as a result, it's a little bit more like cheating and scandal, and that kind of thing, which is quite fun. But yeah, we get to hear about that a lot from different places. And, it's, I think that's important to kind of talk about too, because I think that also we have this tendency to talk about, oh, yes, and in the pure lands of yore, where everyone was just monogamous because they loved God so much.
They were simpler than us. They followed all the religious dictates and they didn't know any better. And they certainly had absolutely no kind of physical stirrings that would lead to the hank and the pank.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the history of sexuality in the Middle Ages is basically the church being like, please stop. I asked you to stop. Over and over again.
Oh, which goes back to, I forgot to ask you about this earlier, Bouchard of Worms.
My favorite guy. Yeah, Mr. Dildo.
Mr. Dildo.
Oh, he loves him. He loves him. Yeah, it's like, so we have this great form of literature, especially kind of in the earlier medieval period, sort of like 9th century, of Bouchard's example, 8th century, 9th century. And where basically priests write these guidebooks for how to ask people in confession what to do. They're called penitentials. And so number one, it gives priests an idea of what penance they should be giving for various sins. And number two, it's like a prompt. It's like a guidebook. It's like, oh, if you don't know what to ask in the confession, here's some things that you can ask people. And Bouchard is just like, hey, you should ask the ladies if they made dildos. It's like, have you made an object to match your carnal desires,
and to use them on other ladies, right?
Yeah. And then do you then take that and fasten it about your hips and use it on other women, right? So he's like, this is an outright admission that women are having sex with other women and that women are using strap-ons, like straight up. This is just, hey girl, do you have a strap-on in the 8th century, right? And we definitely know that strap-ons exist. Like we have an actual receipt from one from the lowlands in the later medieval period, and it was a red leather strap-on that got made for some chick, which is very cool. But so we know these things exist, and these are really valuable things because it's like they're being made out of things like leather, and so that's going to rot over time. And also it's like you don't bequeath your strap on to anyone. You don't go, oh, like I'm leaving this to my niece Alice, my beloved strap on. That's not coming up in the will, right? So that's the only way that we kind of know about it. And, he also asks all kinds of bizarre stuff, which is like, are you doing love spells to make your husband want to have sex with you more? Which is stuff like, are you rubbing honey down your body and then like scraping the honey off and then feeding it to him? One of the love spells is just like, do you swallow during oral sex? Which is like, because that's going to make him love you.
What's the fish one?
Oh, yeah. So there's one where it's like, do you take a fish and insert it in your, like, I think it's a live fish too, and you insert it into your vagina and then wait till like it's died and then cook it and then serve it to your husband, because that's a love magic.
The fish is not actually happening. But how much of this is like the fruit of somebody's imagination of, I call them Vol cells, right? It was the 12th century, the church says there has to be mandatory celibacy. So then they became, as I have taken to saying now since reading your book, because I'd forgotten about that switch to mandatory celibacy in the church. So we're used to say we're ruled by incels, and now we're ruled by vol cells, voluntary celibates.
Vol cells. It's like, yeah, it's and this is the thing, right? So part of our work as historians is saying, okay, yeah, the strap-on thing is definitely real because we're still doing strap-on things.
And the dildos, that goes back to like Roman times, right?
Oh yeah, they're dildoing all over the shop, right? So it's kind of like, and how are you going to keep them down on the farm once they've seen a dildo, right? Like that's how that cat's out of the bag. Everyone's making dildos. It's fine. From there, we can kind of extrapolate a little bit because it's like the fish in the vagina magic doesn't come up in other people's penitentials. So this is probably something that our good friend Bouchard is sitting around being like, oh, and I bet they're putting fish up their vaginas. It's like, okay, bro, like, yeah, absolutely fine.
If he actually wasn't having sex, it just sounds like some weird masturbation fantasy.
Yeah, exactly. So it's sort of like, it's difficult to say because, this could be something that's like a local folk belief, but I still doubt it would happen just because, as the owner and operator of a vagina, like I'm not look, there's I would do anything for love, but I won't do that, etc. Yeah, so like Meatloaf's got that one right. But it is definitely like one of these things where we can kind of corroborate from other sources in order to see what's going on. So for example, I think that probably there are women who are attempting to do love magic by kneading bread down their bodies, baking the bread and feeding it to men. And the reason that I think this is because that comes up in penitentials all over the place, right? Where so that one as like a kind of form of love magic comes up again and again and again, and also like, ooh, that's kind of like sexy. I'm kneading bread on my body. Sure, it's pretty low stakes. You have to make bread anyway. That one makes sense, right? So you've just kind of got to pick through, corroborate with other sources, and then you'll find out what is happening. For example, from medical texts, we see people talking about how often young women are like having sex with each other, right? And they'll say, oh, this is really common for young girls. You'll find that they're like, basically they're fingering each other, right? They're sitting around having sex. And they'll say, oh, super, super common for young women because they've got hysteria, right? Where, their womb is wandering around their body like a weird little animal. And so if they don't have some form of sex, it's going to suffocate. So it's got to come out somehow. So they just kind of do this with each other, and it's fine. It's normal. It's medical. Get them married off, right? You marry them off, and then they'll stop doing that because they'll have a form of a sexuality outside that. So we certainly also see from the standpoint of medical practitioners that they're like, well, women are having sex with each other. And we have women's love notes back and forth from each other. Like, it's always nuns, right? Because nuns are literate, and they're having rather a lot of sex with each other. And we know this because periodically nunneries have to be like, no more sleeping in each other's beds. And definitely no more sleeping in each other's beds naked. And I swear to God, you cannot be calling each other my little girl or my little bird. Like, stop it. We definitely have people's like love notes where they're like, oh, girl, I miss your titties. Things like that, like very specifically. And you're like, okay. Like, so here we know that there's lots of women having sex with women because we have the preponderance of evidence that shows us there. I've never seen anyone corroborate the fish.
Is it like today's world where most people are much more okay with women having sex with one another than with men having sex with one another?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So like, because to a certain extent, like I think that there's one Arabic text that is like, women who like to have sex with women are so refined. Like, yeah, hell yeah, girl. Like, absolutely. I like having sex with women too. Like, wow. Yeah, that's great. And there's also basically this kind of thing where it's like, well, they're not inserting anything anywhere. Like, I mean, other than strap-ons and dildos, which don't count because it's not a member of their body. So is this like kind of really, gray area? And it's very naughty, and you're not supposed to do it. And Bashir Uniforms is going to give you 3 years of penance if you're going around shagging other women, right? Very naughty, right? But it's like, it's nothing to like call the cops over or whatever. With men, it's different, and you see a lot of hand-wringing about this because, well, you're acting like women. Very specifically within this, there is more shame heaped upon anyone who is basically being penetrated because you're acting like a woman. So that's a subversion of nature.
You can't be the receptacle.
Yeah, you can't be the receptacle because they will refer to it as the active and the passive participants. So like Thomas Aquinas writes about this quite a lot, and he's obsessed with it. He's just so mad that monks are having sex with each other, which they are a lot. And so he thinks that you need to put a stop to all this. And very specifically, they're saying, well, you're acting like women. Like, the women are the ones who spend a bunch of time having sex with each other. Knock that off. And it's worse if you are on the receiving end. And then this kind of ramps up over the medieval period, the worrying about homosexuality is really a very late medieval thing, and then it gets much worse in the early modern period, as everything does. So by the kind of very late medieval period / early modern period, it's difficult to say what's what. In Florence, there are like sodomy cops, right, where they're like they're on the beat, but just for like men having sex with men.
The long lost fifth branch of the Italian police force.
And like 100% is just there for like cracking down on this. And it is one of these things where we see crackdowns on men who have sex with men. Again,
what's the punishment?
So it's usually fining in the first instance, but you'll be fined more if you are seen to be the recipient or, the feminine or the passive person. You'll get a higher fine. And this will kind of like go on, and you'll be fined until like, we have examples of dudes who get caught like 10 times. And then they're like, all right, that's it. We're killing you. Which sucks and is awful. But we have to also be very, very careful because, the word that they will just use over and over again is sodomy. Like, someone is in trouble for sodomy. And again, that can mean you went down on your husband, right? And then it's like, oh, that's sodomy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then also, we will see examples of men who are killed immediately for sodomy when they're caught for things. And then you're like, wow, that's wild. What was that? And then it turns out that they raped an 8-year-old, right? Even though it's the same word legally, you have to go look at what the action actually is, and we don't always know. So you can kind of infer what happens there, but that, again, this is like a late medieval, early modern thing. It's like really in the early modern turn, everything gets much worse for gay people, where the medieval people are a little more laissez-faire about homosexuality, because they're like, well, what's a little sodomy between friends? I mean, isn't everyone doing sodomy?
If you have so many forms of sodomy.
Then, I mean, well, odds are you're going to...
What strikes me is, you were saying before, is that there's so many social constructs. There's so many social concepts that you can't talk about without talking about sexuality. And you can't talk about sexuality without talking about sexual violence. It's almost impossible to extract them, just to separate them.
Well, we have a really similar issue with medieval sources, and rape was the Latin term for which is raptus. And raptus is a really tricky one for us, because raptus can basically just means that like some man was wronged and a woman was involved sexually in this. So, for example, it can be called raptus if you get caught having sex with your boyfriend and your father doesn't want you to marry him.
Because the father's been wronged.
The father's been wronged, and so you were raped, right? Whereas if, so one of like the most common punishments for raptus is if like a woman is taken from her house and raped. God knows what that means. There's no real way to know. But then her rapist marries her, then it's okay. It's very difficult for us to read this, because was this woman taken from her house against her will? Or like, did you essentially find a great way of eloping with your boyfriend that your dad doesn't approve of?
Right.
Was this person violently raped or not? And we tend to see sometimes, not always, but sometimes you will see instances wherein, yes, somebody just gets killed for raptus, and you're like, oh yeah, that's probably what you and I would understand as like a violent sexual attack. But for the most part, the way that rape is conceived of is that it's a property dispute between men. And what you've done is you have brought down a woman's value, her bartering value as a marriage prospect, or her value as a wife who is, untouched or whatever. And then you're going to owe something to the husband or the father or the fiance or whatever man is seen to be having ownership of her. That's the person that you've wronged. And so this becomes a property dispute, and then you're going to have to give a certain amount of money to the man in question. And the women, it's just sort of like, meh, that's really not, who cares about all of that?
That spills into modern thinking. I mean, and this is very anecdotal. I was working on a friend's screenplay years ago when I was living in Italy, and in the story there were rapes, and I basically backed away from the project. I was like, I don't want to do this. Again, this is one story, but it's something I've heard over and over and over again, where the woman forgives. Right? In this story, that the woman forgives and the man goes on a killing spree or on some kind of violent spree, seeks revenge. It's like, you've never actually spoken to women. I have had other men tell me women who've been raped forgive so much more easily than the father or the husband.
Fuck you.
Right.
Cool. It's such an annoying one, right? Because it's like there is this expectation, right? And again, because of women's natures. Don't get me wrong. I also have issues with, this idea that, if a woman is ever sexually assaulted, then that becomes like the thing that happened to her in her life. I've got a real problem with like screenplays and things that show women, and it's like, oh, and then her character arc is she gets raped, and I'm just like, fuck you, right? Like, it's cool. The one thing that can happen to you is this.
Almost every survivor I've spoken with has said that. Yeah, the actual event is traumatic, and maybe parts of your life or parts of you somehow feel frozen in time in that moment. But what was even harder was the not being believed. More traumatic than the event itself often is having to keep it to yourself, because you knew that if you told someone, or you fear that if you told someone that they wouldn't believe you, or actually coming out and saying it, they would tell you that you're lying.
This reminds me very much of, one important point that we get from conversations about, again, rape in the medieval period. So the prevailing idea of consumption in both the ancient and the medieval world is what we call the two-seed theory. Right. Mm-hmm. So this is true of Romans as it is of medieval people. Anytime something is like truly weird, people have a tendency to be like, wow, medieval people are really stupid. And I'm like, Romans thought this too. Damn it. Romans are weirder. But the prevailing idea is that men expel semen when they orgasm, and so do women.
Mm-hmm.
But they do it internally. Basically, what happens upon orgasm is that then women release the seed, and these two seeds mix together, and then that's how you get a baby, right? Like they think it's kind of like just another form of semen. They don't know about ova. This is good in one way because there is this emphasis on the idea that women should orgasm during sex, because otherwise, like, you're not going to be able to make a baby. She's going to have to come sometime, guys. But then the downside of this is that, well, in cases where women are raped, if they end up pregnant, then everyone goes, girl, you weren't raped.
There's got to be a downside.
Yeah, it is like, because otherwise, you wouldn't be pregnant now. And, that is one of these things which is like, it's horrifying and it sucks to think about. But then, gosh, it was in the 2000s. There was that, I'm not sure if he was a congressman or senator from Missouri, but when he was arguing for a ban on abortions in cases of rape, he said that in cases of legitimate rape, women's bodies have a way of shutting the whole thing down.
Vaginas just close the vagina door.
Because we're like ducks, and, we've got like this fancy cloaca we can open up and shut down. And so that is also this thing that really kind of makes looking at sexual assault really difficult, and it's just always two steps forward, one step back, both for conceptions of medieval sexuality and our own.
Right.
Because on the one hand, I think it's kind of cool that they're like, well, you should probably be interested in making your wife orgasm if you want to have babies, but then there's immediately a way to punish women for that as well.
It could have been a beautiful thing, right? If there hadn't been this other aspect to it, it could have just been like, well, women have to orgasm. And so if they have to orgasm, then you have to figure out how to make them orgasm. P&V isn't going to do it for so many women.
Yeah, you're going to have to make it work, lads. And I mean, and certainly we see this in medical manuals, like especially Arabic medical manuals. They will be like, yeah, you start off by rubbing them on the top of their pudenda, right? And, it's also something that people talk down about, or they'll say that this is the manner in which the indiscreet bring women to orgasm. And it's like, okay, well, I mean, I don't know what to tell you, buddy. But, and again, that's nothing new either. It's like Freud and his mature and immature orgasm. I'm anti-Freud, so,
I gotta feel like every woman should be anti-Freud.
I simply love to find a philosopher or of any description and then start a fight with them in my brain. That's my hobby.
You said the first time we talked that you started your book because you wanted to start a fight with evolutionary psychologists and then ended up picking a fight with neuropsychologists.
The thing that is incredibly frustrating is I think that within the sciences, and certainly when we're talking about conceptions of sexuality in particular, there's like a hierarchy. And we've decided that neuroscientists are right up the top. If you're scanning brains, we're like, these people, they know what's up, right? And it turns out they don't, because the trouble with people is that they're still people, right? And you will see all of these kind of ridiculous studies when it comes to neuroscience, where it is like, well, men's brains work like this and women's brains work like this, which is absolutely not the case, because that's not how brains work at all whatsoever, because brains work in the way that you tell them to. So it's like when I was in high school, I was really good at doing, advanced algebra. Right. Not so much anymore. You know why? Because I don't do advanced algebra. When I was a hostess in a sushi restaurant, I could calculate bills in my head like that. If you wanted to know what an 18% tip was, it was 2 seconds and I could do it, but I don't do that anymore. Whereas my Latin is really good.
Right.
I use Latin all the time, so that's fine. Or, anyone who speaks a second language will tell you the same thing. When we don't use it for a while, we get back to the country, we're kind of rusty for a couple of days, and then our brain goes, oh, you wanted to speak.
Yeah, 16 years in Italy, and now it's been more than 10 years since I left. And when I talk to friends or when I'm back there, I mean, there's so many words, vocabulary is missing, and I have a stronger American accent.
Exactly. And it's just because your brain isn't doing that. And so what happens if you end up scanning women's brains and men's brains, and you say, yes, this is how I'm going to show conclusively that men's and women's brains are different. What you're actually doing is you're showing that socially men and women are asked to do different things, and our brains respond accordingly.
Right.
And it's really bad, because people will argue that boys and girls should be educated in different ways as a result of how they think there are differences in brains. which is just absolutely ridiculous. There have been studies that used to basically equate the conception of autism with extreme maleness was the way that it was looked at, where it was like, no, we've just socialized autistic girls in a different way, and they are not allowed to get away with the same stuff that autistic boys are, and so basically, there was a ridiculous study done once with newborns. Basically, it was saying, oh, look, if you showed a little boy like an object, like a mobile or something, he would look at the object longer than he would look at a face. And if you showed a little girl a face, she would look at it more than she would look at the object. And, these studies are completely, the said study has been completely debunked because it's non-replicable. And it's also like, yeah, well, the baby's going to kind of like look wherever they're being held.
They can't hold their own head up. Yeah.
Like, what are you talking about? How are their eyes focusing? Like, what do you mean by all of these things? But it gets repeated all the time because it does what people want it to do. It creates this idea of what girls and boys are like, and men and women are like, and our brains are fundamentally similar. And none of that is true. None of it is true at all whatsoever. But what these studies do is they replicate the things that we want to find. And then we say, oh, therefore we see it. And it's this constant denigration of social sciences, of society, of how the humanities works. And it's just like saying, oh, yeah, a brain kind of exists in isolation outside of society. And it is something pure that can somehow be measured. And it can never be measured outside of isolation. And if you understood anything about a brain, you would know that they're constantly changing.
You don't have to see something to believe it. You have to believe something to see it. And what you're talking about makes me think of the way that we justify that women need to be doing certain things to make themselves beautiful to men because men are more visual than women. Boys are more visual than girls. There is literally a TED Talk for children that explains that this is bullshit.
I love to hear that. That's good. Anyway.
I forgot to ask earlier on about the badges because I have to have a pilgrimage badge of a vulva being held up by 3 peni.
Luckily, people make them, and God bless them. They're out there in the world. But yeah, we have this really great source from the late medieval period, and more specifically, it seems to be from the Low Countries. So, what is now Belgium, what is now the Netherlands. And we have absolutely tons of them. They're usually made from like pretty inexpensive materials like pewter. And they are little badges that have sexual scenes, and maybe it's like a little vulva wearing a crown and she's on a horse, or the little vulva who is being carried on a chair by 3 penises, or 2 people having sex under a tree that's growing phalluses, or one of my favorites is a woman who is got a giant dick in a wheelbarrow. It's a carrot or something.
I have not seen that one.
It's a really good one. So there's tons of them. Like there's all these like highly sexual badges that exist, and we don't know exactly what they're for. Right? We don't know. It's funny because people have been like, oh, well, surely these are fertility things, and it's for people who are going on pilgrimage, and then they wear them because of fertility. And maybe, but I mean, like, I just think that you're going too far to get away from the obvious description of them, which is because the thing is, if you go on pilgrimage, right, you are under what we call plenary indulgence. So the idea is that what happens on pilgrimage stays on pilgrimage. You're going to have all your sins forgiven when you get to your destination anyway. So just kind of like help yourself, right? So it's like way like, so people like go and they have a bunch of sex with other pilgrims because you are allowed to, right? Like that's fine. And so I think that the badges are doing a couple things. One, they're like, hey, everybody, I'm up for it because I'm on pilgrimage, like, get it? And we have pilgrims badges that are like totally holy as well, right? Like the famous ones are the scallops that people wear when they are on pilgrimage to something like the Compostela and stuff like that, right? But these are kind of like, you could just be going down to the local church or where, like if I'm from London, going down to Canterbury, right? Like we're the easy ones, you could do it too. And so it kind of shows that you can be having sex. But then I think also it's kind of like a little bit like bachelorette parties now, where everyone has kind of like the penis hat and the penis straw. And you're like, woo, yeah, girls.
I used to live in Nashville, which was the number one bachelorette destination in the country for a while. It may still be. I don't. But yeah, you had penises everywhere. You had penis popsicles, penis whistles, penis hats. And I would look at these women and be like, maybe how about a clitoris?
See, the medieval people are better with that because they're like, out of vulva, looking for 3 dicks who are going to treat my pussy like a queen. And it's like, yeah, all right, like absolutely go for it, right? And this is one of these things that is interesting because we know that they're produced in incredibly great numbers, which means that people are buying them, and they survive to us incredibly great numbers, which also shows that no one's ashamed of them.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like the dildos we can't find. Right. These are things where everyone is like, haha, like that's cute. And you might like keep it around the house. Like you don't throw it away.
Right.
It's like it's a nice memory of the time you went and got laid a lot on holiday, right? So I think that this is really important because it kind of shows us that these cultures have always existed. You know, this idea of excess, if you're like getting together with your girlies and wearing some genitals on you and like going wild. And also that there are these times that everybody accepts everyone's going to be going a little bit wild. But, you know, actually, I think that probably more people were having sex on pilgrimage in the medieval period than are like having sex in Nashville now at a bachelorette party, you know, because morality being what morality is, right? Because now we really like monogamy. And so like you wouldn't go around doing that, would you, if you got a boyfriend back home? Whereas if you're on pilgrimage, you very well might, right? You know, like that's because it would be fun. It would be fun, right? So it's important to see these things because it shows us how sexuality has been this really motivating factor. And I think it's really important to see the vulvas because it's like, you know, we wear penises now because that's the sexy thing. And they're like, yeah, vulvas, that's the one, right?
That was the sexy thing then.
Yeah, exactly. And there is this way more of a knowledge about what's going on anatomically among medieval people than there is now. And I just think that's great. I think that they're so fun. But yeah, you can get replicas online, and I encourage everyone to go buy one right now.
On that note, what would you like people to take away from what you know about sexuality from 1,000 years ago and the liberation of women and of feminism and what we can and cannot take for granted?
Well, I suppose that the number one thing that I want everyone to take away from it is that sexuality and the idea that gender has something to do with it is a completely social construct. That doesn't mean that it isn't happening. It doesn't mean it hasn't happened to you and that you haven't internalized some of it and it hasn't expressed itself in some way through your own relationship to your sexuality. But this is something that is constantly being created and co-created by everything around us, by the culture we live in, by our friends, by our relationships to other people. And there is no such thing as an unmutable, definitive sexuality that you can pinpoint on a map, that you can take a brain scan and say, here you go, here's sexuality, because this is changing all of the time. There is absolutely nothing new under the sun in terms of sexuality. It's just the way that we tend to relate to it. So you're never going to be able to synthesize sexuality in a lab. You're never going to be able to get a perfect read on it. And anyone who is attempting to tell you that they can is trying to sell you something. But the good news is, right, that if sexuality is a cultural construct and a social construct, which it is, then it means then we can deconstruct it and we can remake it in any way that we wish to. And so this isn't bad news. It's good news.
We can do better.
We can do something good at any moment. We just need to choose to.
That was Dr. Eleanor Janega, a medieval historian whose specialties include sexuality and gender roles in the European Middle Ages. To delve deeper into what we discussed, I highly recommend her book, The Once and Future Sex. You can find links to her website, socials, and other work on the episodes page of womenlikesex.com, episode 3. Women Like Sex is a flipped script production. It is executive produced and edited by me, Natasha Stojanovic. Website design and artwork is by Ted Nunez. Edesio Martinez is associate producer. For more episodes and swag, or to subscribe to the podcast or Patreon, please visit womenlikesex.com, the Women Like Sex YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is Women Like Sex. Pass it on.